Bill Roths, our selection committee chairman, will be introducing the 140th inductee in the Iowa Wrestling Hall of Fame. Thank you, Jeff. The 140th selection is Dan McCool. He's been around wrestling going back to the 1970s through 2020 when Dan passed away. Everyone knew Dan McCool. Like, well respected by athletes and coaches, you knew you were at an important competition when Dan McCool was there to cover it. Dan first made his reputation as one of the best wrestling writers in the nation during his years as the primary wrestling reporter at the Des Moines Register. In addition to his outstanding coverage of Iowa wrestling at the high school and college level, Dan often traveled across the nation to report from major USA wrestling events, providing coverage on an international level. One of the books that Dan wrote was called Reach for the Stars. This is a history of Iowa wrestling going back to 1921. 1921 through 1925, the state AAU managed the state competitions. In 2024, 2025, we will celebrate our 100th year of the Iowa High School Athletic Association running the tournament. I'm going to give you a couple items that I went through as I've read this, and I read it, started reading it again this morning, but there's a couple things that stuck out to me. One of them involves a gentleman from Cresco, and his name was Gene Tuttle, and I was looking through this because if you go back into the back part, it shows every state championship match going from 1925 or 1921 forward. So in 1940, 41, and 42, my uncle wrestled for New Hampton. He's mentioned in this book, and it is not 1940 he took third, 1941 he was a state champ, and 1942 he wrestled the longest match in high school history. I didn't read this book until 2012. I officiated high school and college wrestling for 38 years. My uncle never said one word to me about wrestling that longest match. I knew he had been a state champ in 1941. I did not know anything about 1942. In 1942, he wrestled Gene Hunt from Thomas Jefferson, Council Bluffs, in the finals. They went, at that time, the matches were 2 minutes on your feet, and then you went an additional 6 minutes on 2 more on your feet, 2 on defensive position, 2, so it went 8 minutes. At the end of the 8 minutes, the score was still 0-0. Neither one could score against each other. So the referee said, well, we're going to go to an overtime. They had never had any overtime rules. So they went 2 more minutes. Neither one scored. They went 2 more minutes. Neither one scored. They went 2 more minutes. Neither one scored. They went 2 more. Neither one scored. That's 16 minutes of wrestling on the mat. Now get this, my uncle was the defending state champ. The referee looked at the 2 wrestlers and they were both dog tired, he said, and he raised the other kid's hand. My uncle, you know, like I said, I refereed. My uncle would go to Iowa City with me when I'd work a meet at the University of Iowa, or he'd come up to Waterloo to watch a meet I refereed. Never once said one thing to me. 2012, I read the book and I call and I say, Uncle Burl, what's the deal with this? So we sat down and we discussed it. We talked about the overtime rules now and how it has changed. But to that, he never said a word. But from the day that he lost until he was 96 years old, because he died when he was 98. But from the day that he lost that match at the state tournament in 1942 until 2016, when he was 96, he would get up in the morning and he would do 100 push-ups. Every morning, 100 push-ups, 365 days a week. You guys do the math on it. Then I said, well, why'd you quit doing them at 96? And he said, well, I was getting kind of old. So he cut back to 50. So he was still doing 50 until the time that he was in the nursing home. The other thing, so I was looking at that. The other thing, like I said, I was looking up, and one of the things that stuck out to me was I looked at the 1940 finals, and my uncle had taken third. But there was a gentleman from Cresco that had taken second at 85 pounds. But then I went back and researched it a little bit more. 1937, Mr. Tuttle was a runner-up at 85 pounds. He got beat by Albert Lehman from Cresco, or from Osage, excuse me. That was at 85 pounds. The next year, his sophomore year, he wrestled at 95 pounds. He got beat in the finals at 95 pounds by Albert Lehman. His junior year, he bumped up to 105 pounds and got beat by Jerry Germ Lehman, who went on to coach at Lehigh University from Osage, the brother of Albert Lehman. His senior year, he cut back down to 85 pounds, and he ended up getting beat by Jimmy Stoynoff from Waterloo West. 4 times he was in the finals. 4 times he was a runner-up. Still a state champion, I'm sure, in everybody's eyes in Cresco. So without further ado, accepting the award for Dan posthumously is his wife, Diane McCool. Diane?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I feel like I have probably the least wrestling knowledge of anyone in this room. But I was married to Dan for almost 24 years, so maybe something rubbed off. Thank you, Bill, and the Iowa Wrestling Hall of Fame. It's an honor to be here and to commemorate this induction on Dan's behalf. I'm joined this evening by all 4 of Dan's brothers and their wives. Came from 3 states to be with us today, and I'm so happy we could all be together this evening for this great occasion. Of course, I wish Dan was here tonight, as do all of us, but right now I miss him the most because he was a much better speaker than I am. So anyway, I'm going to do my best to keep it reasonably brief and meaningful as well. Many who didn't know Dan well asked if he was a wrestler and if that was why he became interested in the sport. Well, he didn't wrestle. Maybe once, and it didn't go well. But he grew to love the sport as he learned its great history growing up in his hometown of Clarion. Many of you know that Glenn Brand, who went to Clarion High in Iowa State, was an Olympic gold medalist in 1948. I know a little bit of wrestling history. I read this book. All 3 of them. After that, there were many great wrestling teams in Clarion. Dan and his brothers tell stories of racing to the Clarion gym after an early supper so that they could get a spot to watch the wrestling meet. Apparently people would practically hang from the rafters and the basketball hoop to get a spot. Dan loved to take pictures, which many of you may know, especially of wrestling, and that helped him get a job at the Predicament and also for the Wright County Monitor. He did some writing and taking photos while he was still in high school, and so his career began. He worked at newspapers in Knoxville, Iowa and North Dakota before coming back to Iowa to stay. He spent more than 30 years working for the Des Moines Register, where so many became familiar with his work. He was both a photographer and writer for each publication he worked for, which he took great pride in. And he credited great teachers at Clarion High for sparking his interest in both. All sports were important to Dan. He covered so many in his career: boxing, horse racing, but wrestling was always number 1. And he had an especially contentious relationship with basketball, though. As some wrestlers and their coaches do, their seasons often overlap, and they tend to compete for space and fans sometimes too. One of Dan's favorite t-shirts, of which he had many, anyone who knows Dan knows how many t-shirts he had, especially me, said, "The best thing about a basketball floor is wrestling mats from door to door." That was truly him. One of Dan's favorite things about covering wrestling for the Register was the chance to do the ratings each week. And for the uninitiated, not too many in this room I don't think, that's basically listing the best high school wrestlers in each class in order according to skill. So it gave him a chance to talk to the coaches, which he thoroughly enjoyed. The ratings took a lot of time, but he didn't care. He loved it. I was just happy to get to have dinner with him on Sunday nights in the winter to celebrate him finishing the ratings for the week. He was very proud when his final ratings closely matched the results of the state tournament, which they often did. So Dan also had a chance to cover college wrestling and was lucky enough to cover the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. I remember on that trip he shared a room with at least 2 other guys, and I think he might have slept on the floor for part of the time. But it was worth it for him. Once again, he loved it. He'd often be asked by national publications to write stories for them at the same time he was covering a big national event for the Register. Sometimes he'd write 6 stories a day or more. His work ethic was next to none, most likely learned from his dad, Bob, who was a doctor, and his mom, Kitty, who kept 5 boys in check, often single-handedly. In 2009, as the newspaper business began to change and subscriptions lagged, Dan was laid off from the Register. I think I was more anxious than he was about it because he already had a plan. He told me that on his long drives home from wrestling meets in sometimes brutal weather, to keep his mind busy, he'd think about what else he could write about. That's what he did. That's when the idea for the book called Reach for the Stars, the Iowa High School Wrestling Tournament, was born. That was Dan's first book, which ended up being a several years long project with 3 editions. That's when I picked up my second job, this time as a book editor. I was always a writer and still am, but I've done some editing too, and he asked so nicely, I had to say yes. For those who don't know, Dan and I met because we both worked at the Des Moines Register. He was working as a correspondent in Cedar Falls, and I worked in the newsroom in Des Moines. It was my job to talk to him on the phone each day, imagine having that job, to find out what he was writing about so I could tell the sports editor. Well, over time, our conversations gradually got longer and longer, and we talked less and less about work. We met for the first time when he came to the Des Moines office before covering the state wrestling tournament, and I guess the rest was history. We were married for almost 24 years. Okay, back to wrestling. For Dan, it was all about the stories. Sure, he loved the statistics and the ratings, but he loved to tell people's stories, wrestlers' stories. And he loved talking to people to learn everything he could. Dan ended up writing 2 more books after Reach for the Stars. The first one was about the history of the state wrestling tournament in Iowa, another history that he wrote for a different company out of South Carolina. And he was about the best one to write that book, since I think he attended the state tournament more than 40 times. His brothers might be able to put a better number to that than I would, but he went a lot of times. His other book was about former Dowling wrestling coach Bob Dara, a fellow inductee, who was a great coach with a career that was fun to write about. It was more of what Dan was all about, great stories. Throughout his career, Dan became known as an expert on the subject of wrestling. He hated the word guru, but people called him that. He was happy to share his knowledge. I'm so glad he wrote all of those stories and books about wrestling, not only so that we can remember those stories, but so that we can remember him too. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.